What drives a man to ride into the heart of hell? It ain't glory. It ain't money. For Jedediah Stone, it was a promise sealed with a 3-cent stamp and sent halfway across the country. He'd agreed to meet a woman he'd never seen a mail-order bride named Eleanora Vance. But when the Arizona desert tried to swallow her whole, that simple promise became a crucible. He rode for 3 days without a drop of water, fueled by nothing but grit and the ghost of her words on paper. He thought he was saving a lonely schoolteacher. He had no idea he was riding to save the sole heir to a fortune in gold and into a war he was never meant to survive. Jedediah Stone was not a man given to flights of fancy. The world as he knew it was a thing of hard edges and harder truths carved into the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. His past as a Texas Ranger had been scraped away by years of dust and solitude, leaving behind a quiet man who ran a small horse ranch and kept to himself. The ghosts of a botched pursuit in Laredo of men lost on his watch were his silent companions. They were the reason he preferred the company of horses to men. Horses didn't judge your past. They only cared how you sat the saddle. His correspondence with Miss Eleanora Vance of Boston had started as a practical matter. His ranch, nestled in a valley just shy of Dust Devil Gulch, was prosperous enough, but the silence was beginning to echo the emptiness inside him. A friend, a jovial cattleman named Abe, had suggested a mail-order bride. "A man ain't meant to be alone, Jed," he'd said, clapping a dusty hand on his shoulder. "It'll turn you sour." Jedediah had scoffed, but the idea took root. He wrote a plain, honest letter describing his life, his land, and his quiet nature. He didn't embellish, didn't promise riches or a life of leisure. He promised steadfastness. He promised a home. The reply from Eleanora Vance was a surprise. Her penmanship was a thing of elegant loops and precise lines, a stark contrast to his own rough scrawl. She wrote not of loneliness, but of a desire for a new beginning. Her father, a professor of geology, had recently passed, leaving her with a fine education, but no prospects. Boston, she explained, was a city of rigid expectations, and she yearned for a land as open as her mind. Her letters were witty, intelligent, and carried a current of strength that intrigued Jedediah. "Mr. Stone," she wrote in her third letter, "you describe the desert as harsh. I suspect it is merely honest. Unlike the drawing rooms of this city, it does not pretend to be something it is not. I find I am in great need of such honesty." Over 6 months, their letters became the bedrock of a fragile hope. He sent her a photograph of his ranch, the sturdy cabin set against the backdrop of the Dragoon Mountains. She sent him a small daguerreotype of herself. Jedediah had stared at it for the better part of an hour. She wasn't a conventional beauty, not in the way of the saloon girls in Tucson. Her gaze was direct, her chin firm, her dark hair pulled back in a severe but elegant fashion. There was intelligence in her eyes, a seriousness that he found more compelling than any practiced smile. In her last letter, she'd finally confessed the full truth of her situation. Her father, Professor Alistair Vance, had not been just a teacher. He had spent his final years prospecting in Arizona, and against all odds had struck a significant gold claim. It was called the Whispering Abigail, named for her late mother. "The deed and the map to the primary lode are with me," she wrote. Father's partner, a Mr. Silas Kane, attempted to swindle him out of his half. My father's last letter to me was a warning. He trusted no one in the territory with this knowledge but me. It is a heavy burden, Mr. Stone, and I confess the prospect of facing this man alone is daunting. My desire for a new life is now intertwined with a need for a trustworthy partner. Your letters, with their plain-spoken honesty, have been a beacon. I hope I am not mistaken in my judgment of your character. Jedediah read that letter 3 times. Gold. It was a word that drove men mad. It turned honest sodbusters into back-shooting killers. And this Silas Kane. Jedediah had heard the name. Cain was a vulture who circled failing ventures, picking them clean with legal trickery and brute force. He had a reputation as black as a sinner's heart. He wrote back immediately, "Miss Vance, your judgment is sound. The goal does not matter. The man does. I will be your partner. I will meet your train at the end of the line in Maricopa Wells. From there it is a 2-day wagon ride to Dust Devil Gulch. You will be safe here. That is my promise." He sent the letter and began his preparations. He bought a new, sturdy buckboard wagon and 2 strong mules. He aired out the spare room in his cabin, fitting it with a new mattress and curtains he bought from the general store, feeling a blush creep up his neck as the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, gave him a knowing smile. The day Nora's train was due, a storm of biblical proportions rolled in from the Gulf. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the heavens opened up. It wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a violent, angry deluge that turned the dry arroyos into raging torrents. The telegraph line went down first. Then the reports started trickling in. A homesteader riding a half-drowned horse brought word that the tracks 30 miles east of Maricopa Wells had been washed away. A trestle bridge over the Gila River was gone, splintered like kindling. The train he'd said. Her train. Panic, cold, and sharp pierced the calm Jedediah had cultivated for years. He saddled his best horse, a tireless black Mustang named Shadow, who had the grit of the wild lands in his blood. Abe rode over his face, a mask of concern. "Jed, you can't be thinking of riding out in this. The whole desert's a muddy grave right now. Wait for the waters to recede." "She was on that train, Abe." Jedediah said, his voice tight as he cinched the saddle. He packed light a canteen, a bedroll, a box of cartridges for his Colt, and a stale piece of hardtack. He didn't have time for more. "They'll send a party from Maricopa Wells," Abe argued. "Maricopa Wells is half-flooded itself, and they'll be looking for survivors to bring back. They won't be looking to escort a lone woman across 100 miles of washed-out wasteland to Dust Devil Gulch, and they don't know about Silas Cain." He swung himself into the saddle. He looked east toward the broken land where she was a woman, armed with a deed, a map, and a misplaced faith in his promise. The ghosts of Laredo whispered in his ear, taunting him with failure. "Not again. Not this time." "She's my responsibility," Jedediah said more to himself than to Abe. He spurred Shadow forward, leaving his friend standing in the rain, a lone figure against the gray curtain of the storm. The promise on paper had become a covenant of flesh and blood, and he would honor it, or die trying. The ride had begun. The world dissolved into a churning primordial soup of mud and water. The first day of Jedediah's ride was a brutal fight against a landscape that had turned on itself. Familiar trails had vanished, transformed into treacherous, silt-choked gullies. Shadow, with the instinct of his breeding, navigated the unstable ground with a terrifying grace, his powerful legs sinking deep into the muck before finding purchase and lunging forward. The rain finally ceased by midday, but the sun that followed was a merciless enemy. It beat down on the waterlogged earth, baking the top layer into a crust, while the ground beneath remained a soggy trap. Steam rose in shimmering waves, turning the air into a suffocating blanket of humidity. Jedediah's canteen, filled at the start, was a precious, dwindling resource. He rationed it, allowing himself and Shadow only small sips, the tepid water doing little to quench a thirst that was already becoming a constant nagging presence. By nightfall, he'd covered less than a third of the distance he'd hoped. He made a cold camp on a small patch of high ground, the air thick with the buzz of mosquitoes drawn to the standing water. He chewed on the hardtack, the dry biscuit, turning to paste in his mouth. He thought of Eleonora. Was she huddled in a damaged train car? Was she with other survivors? Or was she alone, prey to the elements, and worse, to men who would see a lone woman as an opportunity? The thought gnawed at him more potent than his own hunger. The second day dawned with a cloudless, metallic blue sky. The sun was no longer just an enemy. It was a malevolent god demanding sacrifice. The ground hardened the mud, turning to cracked uneven plates of baked adobe. The water was gone. Sometime around noon, he gave the last few drops to Shadow, pouring the precious liquid into his cupped hands and letting the horse drink. The animal's gratitude was a deep, soft wicker that almost broke Jedediah's heart. From then on, there was nothing. Thirst began to play its cruel tricks. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. His tongue swelled in his mouth, a useless slab of meat. The world began to shimmer and warp at the edges. He saw phantom pools of water in the distance, crystal clear, and inviting only to ride up on them and find nothing but shimmering sand and heat-blasted rock. The ghosts of Laredo returned their faces accusatory in the shimmering air. He saw Sergeant Miller, a good man who had trusted his lead, fall from his horse, a Mexican bullet in his chest. "You were too slow, Lieutenant Stone, too cautious." Jedediah shook his head, the movement sending a spike of pain through his skull. He focused on the image of Eleonora's face from the daguerreotype, her direct, serious gaze. He wasn't Lieutenant Stone anymore. He was Jedediah, a rancher, and he had made a promise. He repeated it aloud, his voice a dry, rasping croak. "I will meet you. I will be your partner. You will be safe." The words were an incantation against the encroaching madness. He rode on his body, moving by sheer muscle memory. The sun beat on his back, the heat penetrating his shirt, his skin, his very bones. Shadow, his magnificent shadow, began to stumble. The horse was at its limit, its powerful muscles trembling with exhaustion and dehydration. Late in the afternoon of the third day, when Jedediah was no longer sure what was real and what was a mirage born of a dying brain, he saw it. Not water, something else. The glint of wreckage, splintered wood and twisted metal lying half buried in the sand and debris of the flash flood's retreat. It was a passenger car ripped from the tracks and tossed aside like a child's toy. A surge of adrenaline, cold and powerful, cut through the fog of his thirst. He urged Shadow forward, the horse sensing the change in him and finding a last reserve of strength. He dismounted his legs, nearly buckling beneath him. The scene was one of utter devastation. Luggage, clothing, and personal effects were strewn across a mile-wide debris field. There were no bodies for which he gave a silent, ragged prayer. The survivors must have been gathered and taken back west to Maricopa Wells. He searched the wreckage, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He found a woman's bonnet, a child's doll, a gentleman's shattered spectacles, but no sign of Eleonora. Had she been taken with the others? Was she safe? Then he saw the tracks, not just the jumbled footprints of dazed survivors. These were different. 2 sets of prints from shod horses leading away from the main group, and alongside them, the smaller, more hesitant prints of a woman's shoes being forced along. He knelt, his vision swimming. He saw a place where she had stumbled, and beside it a small, dark object half pressed into the drying mud. He picked it up. It was a small, leather-bound book of poetry Keats. On the inside cover, in the same elegant script from the letters, was her name, Eleonora Vance. She had been here, and she had been taken. This wasn't a rescue by concerned citizens. This was an abduction. Silas Kane, it had to be. Kane wouldn't have waited for news. He would have had men watching, waiting for her arrival. The flood had merely provided them with the perfect opportunity, a chaotic stage on which to make their move. He followed the tracks, a cold fury now burning away the pain of his thirst. The tracks led east, deeper into the desert, away from civilization towards the lawless badlands that stretched towards the Chiricahua Mountains. They were taking her to a place where a person could disappear forever. He pushed Shadow onward, the horse responding to his master's iron will. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brutal hues of orange and red. And then he saw them, a small campfire, a flickering point of light in the vast gathering gloom. 2 men and a lone figure seated apart from them. Jedediah slid from the saddle, pulling his Colt from its holster. His hands were shaking not from weakness now, but from a controlled rage. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His body was a wreck, but his mind was sharp as a shard of glass. The ghosts were silent. There was only the present. There was only the promise. He tethered Shadow to a skeletal ironwood tree, giving the horse a final desperate pat on the neck. "Wait here, old friend," he rasped. He moved forward on foot, silent as a predator, his worn boots making no sound on the sandy soil. The desert that had tried to kill him would now be his ally. It had taught him silence, it had taught him patience, and it was about to watch him keep his word. The 2 men by the fire were coarse and careless. One was a hulking brute with a tangled beard and a greasy buckskin jacket. The other was wiry and nervous, a man who seemed to twitch more than he moved. They passed a bottle of whiskey between them, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the vast silence of the desert. Eleanora Vance sat on a rock about 15 feet away, her hands bound in front of her. Her traveling dress was torn and stained with mud, but she held her back ramrod straight, her chin up. Even in this state of degradation, she projected an aura of defiant dignity that Jedediah found himself admiring immensely. Her gaze was fixed on the fire, but he could see it was distant, her mind clearly working, calculating. She was no wilting flower. "Kane's gonna be mighty pleased," the big man who the other called Dutch rumbled. "Saved him a whole heap of legal trouble." "I just want to get paid Dutch," the wiry one Rattler whined. "This whole thing gives me the jitters. Grabbing a woman off a train wreck? It ain't right." "Since when did you grow a conscience?" Dutch scoffed, taking a long pull from the bottle. "Kane pays, we don't ask questions. Now shut up and eat your beans. She's the key to the Whispering Abigail, and that's all that matters." Jedediah had heard enough. He had 2 advantages, the element of surprise, and the fact that his opponents were far too comfortable. He crept in a wide arc, using the scattered creosote bushes as cover, until he was positioned behind a jumble of rocks, just beyond the ring of firelight. He drew a breath, the dry air searing his lungs. He could try to shoot them both from here, but a stray shot could hit Nora. No, this had to be close and personal. He waited for the perfect moment. It came when Dutch stood up to relieve himself, turning his back to the camp. Jedediah moved. He wasn't the fastest man in the territory, but years of tracking had made him quiet. He closed the distance in 5 silent strides. Rattler was looking into the fire, lost in his own nervous thoughts. Jedediah brought the barrel of his Colt down in a single brutal arc on the back of Dutch's head. The big man grunted once and collapsed like a felled ox without a sound. Before Rattler could even register what had happened, Jedediah was on him. He kicked the man's feet out from under him, sending him sprawling into the dust. The pistol Rattler had been wearing was sent skittering away. Jedediah's boot came down hard on the man's wrist as he reached for it. A sickening crack echoed in the night, followed by a high-pitched scream of pain. "One more sound!" Jedediah rasped his voice, a terrifying ghost of what it once was. "And I'll send you to hell piece by piece." Rattler, clutching his broken wrist and staring up at the gaunt, sun-blasted specter looming over him, whimpered and fell silent. Eleanora watched the entire violent ballet with wide, shocked eyes. The man who stood there, his face a mask of dust and dried blood, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, was a world away from the steady, plain-spoken rancher from the letters. This was a warrior. Jedediah kicked Rattler's gun further into the darkness, and then turned his attention to her. He knelt, his movements stiff with exhaustion, and used his knife to saw through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she began rubbing the circulation back into them, her gaze never leaving his face. "Mr. Stone?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor she couldn't hide. "Miss Vance," he croaked, then coughed a dry, racking sound. "Apologies for the delay. The trail was washed out." A flicker of a smile touched her lips, a small, courageous thing in the face of such horror. "Your timing seems impeccable nonetheless." She looked at her two erstwhile captors, one unconscious, the other weeping in pain. "These men work for Silas Kane." "I gathered," Jedediah said. He went to Dutch's saddlebag and found a canteen. He didn't check to see if it was full. He just unscrewed the cap and drank the water, a divine shock to his system. He drank until his stomach cramped, then forced himself to stop. He walked over and handed the canteen to Nora. She drank deeply, her eyes closing in relief. When she handed it back, he walked over to Shadow, who had remained patiently where he'd been left. He gave the horse the rest of the water, stroking his neck. "We have to get moving," Jedediah said, his voice already stronger. "Their boss will be expecting them. We have their horses, but we're in his territory." "Where do we go?" Nora asked, getting to her feet. "Back to Maricopa Wells." Jedediah shook his head. "No, that's the first place he'd look, and it's too far. We go to Dust Devil Gulch. It's closer. But we don't ride in the main road. We stick to the high country." He looked at Rattler, who was watching him with terrified eyes. "And you're going to tell me what Kane's plan is." An hour later, they were riding east, leaving Dutch tied securely to a saguaro cactus with a warning carved into the plant above his head, "Stay away." Rattler, with his broken wrist splinted and bound, rode ahead of them, a lead rope from his horse to Jedediah's saddle horn. The wiry man, under the threat of being left in the desert with no water and two broken legs, had sung like a canary. Silas Kane hadn't just wanted the map. He knew Nora was the map. Her father, paranoid and brilliant, had encoded the most valuable coordinates, the location of the main lode, the glory hole, in a series of seemingly innocuous phrases and numbers within his personal letters to her letters she had memorized. Kane planned to hold her captive, forcing her to recite the clues until he had what he wanted, at which point she would become a liability. Even more troubling, Rattler revealed that the law in Dust Devil Gulch was already bought and paid for. Sheriff Brody, a man with a tin star and a flexible spine, was on Silas Kane's payroll. There would be no help from the law. They would be utterly alone. They rode through the night, the moon a sliver of bone in the black sky. They spoke little, conserving their energy. Jedediah could feel the weight of Nora's gaze on him. He was acutely aware of his appearance, filthy, exhausted, a brutal wraith who had appeared out of the darkness. What must she think of him? This violent stranger was the man who had promised her a home and steadfastness. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, they paused on a high ridge overlooking the basin where Dust Devil Gulch lay nestled. It looked peaceful from a distance, a handful of adobe buildings and a single dusty street. But Jedediah knew it was a snake pit. Nora rode up beside him, her face pale but resolute in the gray light. "Mr. Stone," she began, her voice soft, "in your letters you never mentioned you were so capable." Jedediah looked at the town, then at her. His face was a hard mask, but his eyes were weary. "In your letters you never mentioned you were the heir to a war, Miss Vance." "Nora," she corrected him gently. "My name is Nora." "Jedediah," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his parched lips. "But most call me Jed." A silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer the simple correspondence from the letters. The desert had burned that away. They were two people bound by a shared threat, facing a town that offered no sanctuary. "What do we do now, Jed?" Nora asked, her gaze sweeping over the sleeping town below. Jedediah looked at the single street, the sheriff's office, the saloon he knew Kane frequented. He thought of the corrupt lawmen and the ruthless greed that awaited them. He was outmanned and outgunned with a woman to protect and a secret that could get them both killed. "Now," he said, his voice low and steady, "we go to ground, and then we fight back." They didn't ride into Dust Devil Gulch like conquering heroes. They slipped in through the back alleys as the town was beginning to stir, using the pre-dawn shadows as their shield. They left Rattler bound and gagged in a dry wash a mile out of town with a note for his boss pinned to his chest, a simple message from Jed. "She's not yours." It was a declaration of war. Jed led Nora and the 3 horses not to his ranch, which he knew would be the first place Kane's men would look, but to a squat, fortified adobe building at the quiet end of town. A faded sign above the iron-banded door read, "Gus O'Connell, Assayer, fair weights and honest accounting." Gus was a relic from a bygone era, a grizzled old prospector who'd traded his pickaxe for a set of scales and a magnifying glass. He'd been Alistair Vance's oldest and only friend in the territory. Jedediah knocked a specific rhythm on the heavy door. After a long moment, a small shutter slid open, and a pair of suspicious blue eyes peered out. "We're closed," a gruff voice barked. "Gus, it's Jedediah Stone. I have Alistair's daughter with me." The eye widened, bolts were thrown, and the heavy door creaked open. Gus O'Connell was a stooped man with a wild mane of white hair and hands stained with a lifetime of chemicals. He ushered them inside quickly, barring the door behind them. The front room was a cluttered office filled with rock samples, charts, and the precise metallic scent of acid and metal. "Good God, child," Gus breathed, looking at Nora. "You have your father's eyes. I heard the train. I feared the worst." "The worst found me, Mr. O'Connell," Nora said, her voice strained. "But Mr. Stone found me first." Gus's gaze shifted to Jed, taking in his ragged state. "Stone, I heard you were a man to be counted on. Looks like Alistair wasn't wrong about either of you." Over coffee and biscuits, they laid out the situation, Kane's abduction attempt, the encoded clues in the letters, and the corrupted Sheriff Brody. Gus listened, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "Brody's a snake," Gus spat. "Kane slipped him enough gold to plate his spine, not that the man had much of one to begin with. You can't trust him. You can't trust anyone in this town who smiles too easy. Kane's money flows here like whiskey." "We need a place to stay, Gus," Jed said. "A place to think. My ranch is no good." "You'll stay here," Gus declared, slapping his hand on a heavy oak table. This building was a Wells Fargo outpost back in the day. The walls are 2 feet thick. The windows are barred and the back door is solid iron. It's more fortress than office. You'll be safe enough for a spell. For 2 days, the assayer's office became their sanctuary and their war room. While Jed rested his body, slowly recovering from the ordeal in the desert, Nora and Gus pieced together her father's puzzle. She would recite the phrases from his letters, words that had seemed like paternal advice or fond remembrances. "Remember the 30 paces I took from the old sycamore the day your mother lost her locket? The vein runs north by northwest, following the line of the Seven Sisters constellation as it rises over Dragon's Tooth Peak. The blasting sequence is simple: 3 charges, then 2, then 1. Just like the age you were when we left Boston." To her, they had been memories. To Gus, whose mind was a map of the local geology, they were precise instructions. He cross-referenced them with his own topographical charts, his hands moving with a sudden youthful excitement. "The man was a genius!" Gus exclaimed, his finger tracing a line on a map. "He didn't hide the mine, he hid the method. The Whispering Abigail, the part Kane knows about, that's just a surface deposit. Enough to keep a man busy, but not the mother lode. Alistair found the heart of the mountain child, a quartz vein thick as a man's chest, shot through with gold." As they worked, a quiet intimacy grew between Jed and Nora. She would tend to his blistered skin, her touch gentle and professional. He would watch her marveling at the sharp, focused intellect that matched Gus's own. The prim Boston schoolteacher had been replaced by a determined strategist who held the key to a fortune not in a document, but in her very memory. "He taught me to observe," she explained one evening, her eyes soft with remembrance. "He said the world is a book, and most people only read the cover. He taught me to read the pages." Jed, a man who read the world through the movement of a horse or the shape of a cloud, understood completely. They were more alike than he could have ever imagined. The practical arrangement of a mail-order marriage felt like a distant, flimsy dream. What was growing between them, here in this dusty fortress, was far more real and infinitely more dangerous. The siege began on the third day. It wasn't with guns, but with whispers. Sheriff Brody paid a visit, his demeanor a practiced blend of concern and authority. "Mr. Stone," Brody said, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, "word is you brought a woman into town, and that you had a run-in with a couple of Silas Kane's associates. Mr. Kane is a respected businessman. He's filed a complaint, abduction and horse theft." "The only abduction," Jed said, his voice flat and cold as he stood in the doorway blocking Brody's entry, "was committed by his men against Miss Vance. As for the horses, I considered them fair payment for my trouble." Brody's eyes narrowed. "I'm the law here, Stone. I suggest you turn the woman and the horses over to me. I'll sort this whole mess out." "I have no doubt you will, Sheriff," Jed replied. "Right into Kane's pocket. Now get off this property." Brody's face turned florid. "This ain't over," he snarled before turning and stomping away. The next phase was isolation. None of the townsfolk would come near the assayer's office. The baker who usually delivered to Gus suddenly wouldn't sell to him. The boy who watered their horses for a nickel was warned off by one of Kane's hulking thugs. They were an island in a hostile sea. The psychological pressure mounted. At night, they'd hear men walking past, their voices loud, making veiled threats. A rock shattered one of the thick front windows, sending glass skittering across the floor. Through it all, Nora remained unnervingly calm. The fear was there in the tightness of her jaw and the shadows under her eyes, but she channeled it into purpose. With Gus's help, she finished assembling the puzzle. They now had it all: the location, the entrance, a concealed shaft behind a rock slide, not the main mine entrance, and the method to get to the lode. The breaking point came late on the fourth night. Nora was by the window, peering through a gap in the curtains when she saw him. Silas Kane himself, standing across the street under the light of a saloon lantern. He was a tall, elegant man, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed absurd in the dusty town. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking directly at her, a confident, predatory smile on his face. He lifted his hat in a mock salute, then turned and walked away. The gesture was more terrifying than any thrown rock or shouted threat. It was a promise of inevitable victory. Nora turned from the window, her face ashen. "He knows I'm the key," she whispered. "He won't stop. He'll never stop." Jed moved to her side. He looked at her, at the fierce, frightened woman who had ridden into a nightmare. He looked at Gus, old and frail, but defiant. He looked at the barred windows and the heavy door. This fortress would not hold forever. You couldn't win a siege when the whole world outside was the enemy army. "No," Jed said, his voice quiet, but resonant with a newfound certainty. "He won't. Which is why we're not going to wait for him to come to us any longer." He turned to Gus. "Is there dynamite at the mine?" Gus's eyes lit up with a wild, dangerous glint. Alistair always kept a crate of the good stuff in a dry cache near the hidden shaft. "For geological survey," he called it. Jed nodded slowly. A plan was forming, a desperate gamble born of fire and necessity. "Good," he said, his gaze shifting back to Nora. "Because we're going to give Mr. Kane exactly what he wants. We're going to the Whispering Abigail, and we're going to burn his whole world down." The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would use the darkness before moonrise to slip out of town not as fugitives, but as hunters. Kane's arrogance was his weakness. He believed he had them trapped, a rat in a cage. He would never expect the rat to chew its way out and go for the throat. Their goal was the concealed entrance to the Whispering Abigail, located in a series of rocky canyons 5 miles north of town. It was treacherous country, impossible to approach with a wagon. They would have to go on foot, carrying only what they needed: water guns and the knowledge in Nora's head. Gus, his old legs not up to the trek, would be their anchor and their diversion. An hour after they left, he was to start firing his shotgun out the back window of his office, yelling and making a commotion as if he were repelling a direct assault. It was a thin ruse, but it might buy them the time they needed. "You be careful, you hear?" Gus said, his gruff voice thick with emotion as he clasped Jed's hand. He then turned to Nora. "Your father would be so goddamned proud of you, child." Nora hugged the old man tightly. "Come back to us, Gus," she whispered. "I ain't going nowhere." He winked, hefting his shotgun. "Got a score to settle with Kane's windows." They slipped out the back, melting into the inky blackness. The horses had been moved to a hidden box canyon during the first night, a precaution Jed had insisted upon. The walk was tense, every rustle of a bush, every skittering lizard sending a jolt of adrenaline through them. Jed moved with a ranger's practiced stealth, Nora following in his footsteps, her breathing controlled her senses on high alert. The Boston intellectual had been stripped away, leaving a survivor in her place. They reached the horses without incident and rode hard for the canyons, the sound of Gus's shotgun blasts eventually echoing faintly behind them, a lonely defiant roar in the night. They tethered the horses in a thicket of mesquite and proceeded on foot, with Nora now leading the way. Using the jagged silhouette of Dragon's Tooth Peak against the star-dusted sky as her guide, she navigated the maze of arroyos and rockfalls with unerring accuracy. She was no longer just reciting her father's words. She was living them. "It's here," she said finally, her voice a hushed whisper. They stood before a massive ancient rock slide, a chaotic jumble of boulders and scree. To any other eye, it was an impassable dead end. Following the memorized instructions, Nora counted 30 paces from a distinctive gnarled sycamore tree. She stopped and pointed to a section of the rock slide that seemed no different from the rest. "The entrance is behind that large flat slab of granite." It took both of their strengths, using a sturdy ironwood branch as a lever to shift the slab. It moved with a groan of protest, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind it, the hidden mouth of the Whispering Abigail. A cool, earthy smell, the planet's own breath wafted out to greet them. Inside, the air was still and cold. Jed lit a lantern, its yellow glow pushing back a darkness that felt ancient and absolute. They found the cache of dynamite exactly where Gus had said it would be, a wooden crate tucked into a dry alcove, sticks of the volatile explosive nestled in sawdust. Jed selected several sticks along with a length of fuse and blasting caps. "What now?" Nora asked, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Now we set the trap," Jed said, his face grim in the lantern light. "Kane thinks he's chasing you for your knowledge. We're going to let him catch us, but the prize won't be gold. It'll be this." He held up a stick of dynamite. Their trap was laid not in the hidden tunnels, but in the main part of the mine, the one Kane knew about. They entered it through a connecting passage. Jed's plan was to lure Kane and his men into the primary shaft, and then use the dynamite to seal it, burying them alive. It was a brutal, ugly plan, but Kane had left them no other choice. As Jed carefully placed the charges at a key structural point in the main tunnel, a low rumble echoed from outside. Voices. Kane had taken the bait. Gus's diversion had worked, but it had also sent the wolf straight to the den. "They're here," Nora breathed. "Sooner than I hoped," Jed muttered, working faster to set the fuses. "Get back to the hidden passage. When I light this, you'll have maybe 3 minutes. Don't wait for me." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "That's not a request, Nora," Jed said, turning to face her. His eyes were intense. "I made a promise to keep you safe. I aim to see it through. Now go." Reluctantly, she retreated into the darkness of the connecting tunnel, leaving Jed alone in the main shaft. He could see the bobbing lights of lanterns approaching the mine entrance. He heard Silas Kane's cultured, commanding voice. "Spread out, find them. The woman is not to be harmed. The man stone is expendable." Jed flattened himself behind a cluster of ore carts as 2 of Kane's thugs entered, rifles at the ready. He waited until they passed, then moved like a phantom, taking them out from behind with silent, non-lethal efficiency. 2 down. He crept towards the entrance. He could see Kane standing just outside, flanked by 3 more men, including the hulking form of Dutch, his head bandaged but his expression murderous. They had clearly found and freed him. Then the situation twisted. A movement in the shadows near Kane caught Jed's eye. It was Rattler, the weaselly gunman whose wrist Jed had broken. He wasn't with Kane's men. He was hiding a pistol in his good hand. Jed saw the flicker of betrayal in the man's eyes. Rattler wasn't here for the fight. He was waiting for an opportunity to claim the prize for himself, likely by putting a bullet in his boss's back when the time was right. The chaos Jed needed had just been delivered. He lit a short fuse on a single stick of dynamite and hurled it out towards the far side of the mine entrance. The explosion was deafening, a brilliant flash of light and a shower of rock and dirt. It was the signal. As Kane's men instinctively turned toward the blast, Jed opened fire not to kill, but to sow confusion, his shots ricocheting off the rock walls with terrifying shrieks. "He's in there!" Dutch bellowed, charging into the mine. This was the moment. As Dutch and another gunman rushed past his position, Jed lit the main fuse, the one that would bring the mountain down. The fuse sputtered to life, a small, angry snake of fire, eating its way toward the dynamite charges. He turned to run for the connecting passage, but his path was blocked. Silas Kane stood there, a silver-plated derringer in his hand, his elegant suit now covered in dust, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have been a remarkable nuisance, Mr. Stone," Kane said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "But your part in this drama is over." Before Kane could fire, a shot rang out, not from Kane's gun, but from the entrance. Rattler had made his move, but his aim was poor, the shot kicking up dust near Kane's feet. The betrayal, however, was the only distraction Jed needed. He lunged not at Kane, but past him, tackling him and sending them both sprawling to the ground as the fuse burned ever shorter. The world became a blur of desperate struggle. Jed fought to get away. Kane fought to hold him there, to die with him. From the corner of his eye, he saw Nora emerge from the connecting tunnel, a heavy miner's pickaxe in her hands. She hadn't run. She had come back for him. Dutch, seeing the sputtering fuse, finally understood the trap. "It's a cave-in!" he screamed, turning to scramble out of the mine. Nora didn't hesitate. With a cry of desperate rage, she swung the pickaxe not at Kane, but at a large, precariously balanced timber support right next to him. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. The deep groaning rumble started almost immediately. The ceiling above them began to fracture. "Jed!" Nora screamed. Jed kicked free of Kane's grasp and scrambled toward her, grabbing her hand and pulling her into the relative safety of the hidden passage just as the world collapsed. The dynamite charges went off with a cataclysmic roar that was swallowed by the greater roar of tons of falling rock. The main entrance to the Whispering Abigail ceased to exist, replaced by a solid wall of shattered stone, sealing Silas Kane and his greed in a tomb of his own making. In the sudden ringing silence and the choking dust, Jed and Nora clung to each other, their bodies trembling, their lungs gasping for air. They were alive. They had won. The aftermath was silence, a profound ringing silence broken only by the settling of dust and their own ragged breaths. The lantern had been extinguished in the blast, plunging them into absolute blackness. For a moment, panic threatened the primal fear of being buried alive. "Jed!" Nora's voice was a small, trembling thing beside him. "I'm here," he said, his own voice rough with dust. He fumbled in his pockets, his fingers closing around a matchstick. It scraped twice against the rock wall before flaring to life, a tiny defiant star in the suffocating dark. He found the lantern and relit it. The steady golden glow was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They were battered, bruised, and covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust, but they were whole. The connecting passage had held. He looked at the wall of rubble that had been the main tunnel. There was no sound from the other side. Kane Dutch and any others caught inside were gone entombed forever within the very treasure they had sought to steal. Rattler, Jed said, remembering the traitor. He was outside. They made their way carefully back to the hidden entrance. Pushing aside the granite slab, they emerged into the cool pre-dawn air. The sky was beginning to soften to the east, the first promise of a new day, painting the horizon in shades of violet and rose. Rattler was there, sprawled on the ground, a bloody wound on his temple. His gambit had failed. He'd been too close to the blast, and a piece of flying rock had knocked him unconscious. Jed checked his pulse. He was alive. "What do we do with him?" Nora asked, her face hard in the growing light. "We give him what Cain bought for himself," Jed said. "A little taste of the law." They took Rattler's gun and tied him up securely. The long walk back to town felt different. The tension of the hunt was gone, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion and the stark reality of what they had done. They hadn't just survived. They had been judge, jury, and executioner. As they reached the outskirts of Dust Devil Gulch, the sun was cresting the mountains. The town was just waking up, plumes of smoke beginning to rise from kitchen chimneys. Their first stop was the assayer's office. Gus threw the door open before they could knock his face a mess of anxiety. When he saw them filthy but alive, he let out a whoop of joy that was half-sob. "I heard the blast, I thought—" "We're all right, Gus," Jed assured him. "It's over." While Nora recounted the night's events to the astonished assayer, Jed walked down the main street, dragging the now conscious and terrified Rattler behind him. He walked straight to the sheriff's office. Brody was sitting at his desk drinking coffee. When he saw Jed caked in dust and fury with Rattler in tow, the color drained from his face. "Stone! What's the meaning of this?" he blustered. "This is Rattler," Jed said, shoving the man into a chair. "He was working for Silas Cain. He'll testify that Cain hired him and others to kidnap Miss Vance. He'll testify that you, Sheriff, were on Cain's payroll to cover it up. The rest of them, including Cain, had a bit of a mining accident up at the Whispering Abigail, a permanent one." Brody stared his mouth agape. His authority built on Cain's money and bluster had crumbled to dust overnight. "This town needs a new Sheriff, Brody," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. "I suggest you be gone by noon. If you're not, I'll pin this star to Rattler's chest, and his first official act will be arresting you for conspiracy." Jed didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, leaving the two corrupt men to contemplate their ruined futures. He knew Brody would run. He returned to find Nora standing on the porch of the assayer's office, watching the sunrise. She had washed her face, and in the clean morning light, he saw not the serious woman from the photograph, or the terrified victim from the desert, but a partner, a survivor, a founder. He walked up to stand beside her. For a long time they were silent, simply watching the light spread across the land, chasing the shadows from the dusty street. "The Whispering Abigail," she said softly. "It's all mine now." There was no triumph in her voice, only a quiet weariness. The gold had been the cause of so much death and pain. "It's ours," Jed corrected her gently. "If you'll still have me as a partner." She turned to look at him. Then, her eyes, the eyes her father had given her, were clear and full of a profound understanding. The letters, they feel like they were written by two different people, a lifetime ago. "They were," Jed agreed. That man, the rancher he was offering a home. That woman, the teacher she was accepting. But they didn't know. "What didn't they know?" she asked. "That a home isn't something you're given," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "It's something you build, something you fight for, together." He reached out, not with the roughness of a warrior, but with the gentle hesitation of the man who had written the letters, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her dusty cheek. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance that was more powerful than any written word. The gold was there waiting in the heart of the mountain. It would make them wealthy beyond measure. But as they stood there in the dawn of a new day, in Dust Devil Gulch, they both knew. The real treasure hadn't been the gold. It was the discovery of something far more rare and precious, a courage they didn't know they had, and a partnership forged in the crucible of the unforgiving West. The ride was over, but the journey was just beginning. In the end, it was never about the gold. It was about a promise. Jedediah Stone rode into the jaws of death not for a fortune, but for a woman he knew only through her words. And Eleanor Vance, faced with the brutal greed of the frontier, found a strength she never knew she possessed. They faced down a corrupt town, a ruthless villain, and the very desert itself, and from the dust and ashes, they didn't just build a life, they earned it. Their story is a testament to the fact that the greatest treasures of the Old West weren't buried in the ground, but were forged in the hearts of those with the courage to fight for them. What would you ride 3 days without water for? Let us know in the comments below. If you were captivated by the story of Jed and Nora, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a true tale of Western grit. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the untamed pages of history.